We'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm here with Dr. Zenger. Jack, good to have you with me.
Nice to be with you, Joe, on this exciting occasion.
We're glad we made the decision to be together.
Right.
And we're going to talk about the art of effective decision making. And that's because, we are experts at making bad decisions. I'll bet we have more bad decisions than most people. But this is a critical topic. We're going to talk about how important decision making is. And if you just joined us, one of the things we want you to do is take a short self-assessment. It's only about 7 minutes. You get into the self-assessment by getting on your browser, typing in the link bit.ly/ZFDecide. This analyzes or gives you a peek into your preferences around 4 different enabling behaviors. And it also gives you an assessment on 2 really critical dimensions around decision making. So get in and do that self-assessment. We think it's going to help with the learning today, and it really is aimed at you getting some insight from this process. Let me talk a little bit about the objectives, and some of you might be doing the self-assessment, but let's just chat about this a little bit. We want to create for you today in the webinar a micro-learning experience based on research from Zenger, Folkman, and others. And for us, there's a difference between just information and a learning experience. And Jack and I this week we were working on a chapter in our new book, The New Extraordinary Leader, and it was on learning methods. And Jack, what is the worst? What's the worst learning method? Do you remember what we said in there?
Probably reading a book or hearing a talk by somebody.
Yeah, that's it. Lectures.
Lectures.
And that's what this webinar could be if we just gave you information. But to make it a learning experience, one of the things we've discovered is the power of having a self-assessment and having you think about decision making. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to give you results from your self-assessment. We're going to give you some insights from some research that we've discovered around how to make effective decisions, the power of effective decisions, and what really goes into them. Also, if you just sit and listen, that's not a learning experience. But if you join us and sort of say, okay, what could I personally do to be better at decision making? That makes it a learning experience. And so we'll strongly encourage you to not just sit back and listen, but to use a self-assessment to actually go through and find an area where you could improve in your decision making. So I'm just going to say it for the last time. If you haven't started that self-assessment yet, we'd like you to start it. You go to this link, bit.ly/ZFDecide, DECIDE. It's in lowercase. And you can take the self-assessment. Only takes about 7 minutes to complete that self-assessment. And if you put in your email address, you'll get an email of the report. If you don't, you'll still get the report on your screen. And you need to hit the submit button to have the email report sent to you. All right. Let's talk about decision making. Jack, go ahead.
Yes. So you see on the screen the question, are decisiveness and decision making topics of high interest to you? As I've been thinking about this for the last few days, it's become pretty clear to me that one way of describing life in general is to say that it's really it's a series of decisions we make. It's the quality of the decision we make, and it's our timeliness in making those decisions that really then define our success in life. And so we invite you to kind of ponder with us these 2 topics, decisiveness and the quality of decisions. And so we would invite you to kind of think about what is the biggest problem in your organization. And we've given you 3 alternatives to ponder. Are decisions made too quickly? First question. Are decisions often being delayed? Second question. And the last question is around the quality of those decisions.
You know, Jack, I'd say yes to all of those. I mean, you know, as you think about, you know, I can think of examples of all three of those that you know, we've made.
And we invite you to think, all of you, about whether those apply to you personally and to your organization. We were struck by a quotation that we saw from McKinsey and Company recently, who published an article in their quarterly publication called 5 Trademarks of an Agile Organization. And it was fascinating that so many of their ideas pertained to our topic today around decision making. And as you read through that, you'll see that, you know, the first point had to do with the fact that what they observe is that organizations are moving toward a greater propensity to make a 70% decision now rather than waiting for a 100% decision sometime off in the future. That they are seeking to have smaller, more frequent decisions, that they test, that the way of making decisions is changing, that we are not seeking to have a completely consensus decision, but we're encouraging everyone to have input and also giving greater weight to those people who have more knowledge and more experience on that topic. And then I was really fascinated by the last point that you see here in this text, that we're learning to disagree. We're learning to have people, both the leaders and all the participants in a decision, to be able to disagree, but then go ahead and commit to the final decision that's made. We found those to be some fairly interesting insights into what's happening in decision making.
And what's becoming true is, you know, you'd think with more information we'd be able to make better decisions, but instead we've just got more confusion. But the only way to really test if a decision is good or bad is to make the darn thing, right? And all of a sudden, you know, and that's
right.
what they're saying. Get that decision made, but be ready to change it.
So we'd like to introduce you to a concept that strikes us as being kind of relevant and maybe, you know, very important, and that is that there are two different things, much like a pair of scissors. There's the willingness to make a decision, and we'll call that broadly being decisive, a willingness to be decisive. And then there is a process of making a quality decision, which is the actual process and steps that occur as the decision is made. And let's just talk a little bit about those two, because we think that one of them by itself is not very valuable. It is the combination of the two, much like a pair of scissors or a pair of pliers, that when they are together, they become very powerful. For this question on what is decisiveness, we very much tip our hat to a fellow named Georges Potworski, or maybe Potworowski, who wrote a doctoral dissertation at the University of Michigan back in 2010 that was labeled "The Varieties of Indecisive Experience." And we very much acknowledge his influence on our thinking. What we came to was this notion that decisiveness is not necessarily a standalone strength. It only has value when it is accompanied by a rigorous decision-making process. So just think about this with us, if you will. A good decision-making process is of no value unless the responsible person is willing to make a decision and act on that decision. Similarly, we know people who are very decisive. They make rapid-fire, quick decisions, but they're not very good decisions. And so that isn't a particularly desirable trait by itself. kind of like having one scissor by itself rather than a pair of scissors. And so the idea is that it is the combination of these two that become very powerful and very, very useful. The dissertation that was done by Georges Potworowski was really insightful in that he had done a great deal of research on what causes people to be indecisive. And we've listed there four elements that he talked about. We've changed the wording of them a little bit, but again, we're all familiar with the fact that it's very easy to put off decisions. I need more time. I'm not sure about, I worry about the outcome or the consequences of this decision. The second one is waffling. People are not willing to commit to a fundamental premise or a principle. He argues that this may have to do with people's self-confidence and self-esteem, that they're very concerned about pleasing other people. Maybe it's that they really have become comfortable with the status quo. All of those things that we're familiar with. The third one was dependence. Those of you who are married or have a partner in life, it's very easy to turn to him or her and say, well, what do you think? And what shall we do? What shall we do tonight? What shall we do then? And we have an over-reliance sometimes on other people and wanting to defer to them, and we're worried about the kind of the social consequence of us making decisions. And so we rely on who do I talk to last? External opinions are very influential in the decisions that I make. And the final cause of people being indecisive may just be don't have the right information, I've lost the necessary papers, it's just kind of confusing, and so it's just my lack of personal organization that causes me to be relatively indecisive.
Well, those all work for me. I mean, as I go through my indecision. Of course, my wife makes all the big decisions.
All right.
And I make the big decisions.
Yeah.
She makes the small ones. There are no big decisions. As we talk about this idea of decisiveness and then kind of the decision-making process, how a decision gets made, there's this decisiveness element and then the quality element of it. The process really is about, how you make it, how you gather the data, how you go through that process. What we've discovered is there's some really strong psychological hurdles that make the decision-making process difficult. So let's say you wanted to buy a new car. Jack, you just bought a new car. He always, when we go to lunch, he says, do you want to drive or would you like to go for free? Because he bought a Tesla. And then he got his electric bill. And then he said, well, it's not really free. It costs a little bit. And then we got actually chargers here at the building. So now it's free again. So anyway, as you think about buying a car, I've always found this to be a really difficult process because there's lots of different types and brands and models and dealers and should you lease or buy. And you think about that, gosh, it's hard. It's sometimes really difficult to make a decision. So a process would typically start with an understanding of the big picture. So imagine yourself, you're a newlywed couple. You both you've struggled through school. You've been poor students. Now you've both got good jobs. You're making good money. And you think, gosh, we want to buy a cool car, an impressive car. And as you think about doing that, a lot of times you don't think about the big picture. You think about your immediate needs right now. And so you go off and you buy a sporty car. It's a two-door. It zips around. It's terrific. About a year later, you get pregnant. The two of you get pregnant. And, well, one of you gets pregnant, but you're going to have a baby. And you have the baby, and then you discover there's no way to get a baby in the back seat. And so what do? You buy a minivan. as you think about that decision-making process, understanding that big picture is a critical element. The second element is identifying the goal. What's my goal here? What am I trying to accomplish? I want to buy a car, but I, want to retire early and travel the world. And so which is most important to you? Then the next thing is we start to gather data. And our assumption is the more data we get, the clearer our decision will be. And, well, that's sort of true, except what Leon Festinger called cognitive dissonance. And what we find when we gather more data is that there's different alternatives, is that oftentimes data, you get one element with one thing and you don't get it with the other. And so there's options, and they're not there's not a universal good way to go. And so typically when we go into this process, we experience a lot of dissonance the more data we gather. And as we gather more data, then we start to eventually winnow it down into a few alternatives. And the way I do this is I call my brother-in-law, and he reads, all these magazines and gets all this consumer reports and things like that. And I'll say, what would you do? And he says, I would do X. And it's like, oh, okay. Or you talk to your mechanic, or you talk to somebody that has bought that car. So you get these opinions, and finally we evaluate and make a decision. What's interesting about making a decision is that this dissonance you experience with all these different alternatives, as soon as you make a decision, it's uncomfortable to still go around and saying, well, I bought this car, but, and I bought this car and I wanted a candy apple red car, but I couldn't find it. If you experience this dissonance, what you're going to do is you're going to go through a process to relieve the dissonance. And so we go through this funny process where we say, well, there was this fact and this fact and this fact, and I ignored it, and I made this decision anyway. And we start to rationalize our decision. Now, it's natural that we do this, but it's also the reason why sometimes we make a bad decision and we refuse to recognize it. It's because we've gone through this dissonance reduction process. We've rationalized our decision, and it's hard for us to come back and say that was a bad decision.
Well, and it wasn't Festinger's main point that once you've leaned toward a decision or made a decision, you begin to ignore information that would be contrary to that. So you deliberately don't pay attention to it, or you discount it. And so we only begin to ingest information that supports our decision.
Right. And as you think about bad decisions, the only thing worse than making a bad decision is refusing to change it, right? And then you kind of live with that decision for an awful long time.
Right.
And so as you think about the decisions you've made and about going through this cognitive dissonance process, what we'd like you to do is you've probably got your self-assessment done. And we'd like you to look at the first part of that self-assessment. And basically, it looks at two dimensions of a decision, your decisiveness and your decision-making quality. And we asked 10 questions in the survey, in the second part of the survey, that really assessed your ability to, are you more focused on quality? Do you want to make the right decision? Do you gather a lot of facts? Do you do that? Or are you tend to be quick at making a decision? Are you more decisive? Which is your highest score? And so think about your highest score. Are you higher on decisiveness? Are you higher on decision quality? Are you about equal on both? Both are critical. They're the two sides of the scissors, right? They're that's what makes the pair of scissors or the pliers. And we think both are critical. And our tendency is to be stronger at one than the other, right? So let's talk a little bit about the impact of decision making. As you think about decision making, and if we look at your effectiveness at making decisions and overall leadership effectiveness, this is an absolute mirror of how we've perceived the effectiveness of a leader. And it's scary because if you're not very good at making decisions, you're not a very good leader. I mean, you're going to be rated lower on almost every other leadership quality. If you're average at making decisions, you're average overall. If you're great at it, you're great at it. This is so tantamount to being a great leader, to being an excellent leader. And we think it has a tremendous amount of influence over how you're perceived as a leader. We also know that it has influence on, for instance, the confidence that people have that will achieve our strategic goals. So we looked at decision-making effectiveness and how confident your direct reports are. If you're poor at making decisions, your direct reports were at the 27th percentile. If you're great at making decisions, your direct reports are at the 75th percentile on their confidence that you're going to achieve your strategic goals. The last thing we looked at is we looked at a group of high potentials, and then we looked at their decision-making ability. And we found that if you're better at making decisions, you're more likely to be rated as a high potential. And if you're poor at making decisions, you're more likely to be rated as having to develop in place. And so it affects your overall evaluation as a leader, the confidence that people have in your ability to make your strategic goals, and your ability to be rated as a high potential. So you may believe that you know how effective you are at making decisions, but we actually tested this and we found that the person themselves is really poor at evaluating their decision-making effectiveness. Bosses, and the statistic there is they only predict 5% of the variance, and actually managers predicted 32% of the variance, direct reports 29% of the variance, peers 15, and others 14. Everybody is clear about how good you are at making decisions than you are. And so if you say to yourself, I think I'm pretty good, if you say, well, I'm pretty lousy, then you may be better. So we're not very good at predicting that.
So now we're going to give you a chance to kind of reflect a little bit about decision making and who makes better decisions than others. And we're going to begin by just asking you to think about top managers and supervisors. So just for a moment, just kind of think about in your own mind, who tends to make more high-quality decisions? And if you said that you thought that the top managers made better decisions, you're correct. The data that we have shows that there is a difference. The difference is, not maybe quite as dramatic as those two bars would possibly suggest, but it's clear that in the perceptions of others, top managers do indeed make better decisions. Let's try one more possibility, men versus women. So what do you think? Do men, as a rule, are they perceived to make better decisions than women? And if you said that men are perceived as making higher quality decisions, that is indeed correct.
We need to caution here because in this book we're just releasing on the new Extraordinary Leader, there's a new chapter in there on men versus women. We actually found that women end up being better leaders than men overall. Right. But there was one area where men were tended to be better, and that was on strategic perspective, and this decision-making comes out as another element where men tend to rate higher than women.
Another question is, what's the impact of experience? So younger colleagues versus your older colleagues? Which of those do you think end up making better decisions? And the data that we have indicates that, indeed, as you might expect, experience does have some value. And so the older colleagues were perceived as making better decisions than their younger colleagues. And then we move on to different functional areas. A lot of you who work in larger organizations know that there are differences in the departments and the functions that people work in. General managers were perceived as making the wisest and best decisions. And you see them down the line: legal, R&D, product development, so forth. And then you get down toward the bottom, and the next to last is the quality function, the quality management. And then comes the HR and training functions in organizations. So decision-making seems to be perceived to be different depending on what functional area you inhabit.
So let's talk a little bit about typical approaches to really training people around decision-making. And what we found is there's a lot of training out there, and the typical decision-making training focuses on problem solving. It talks about decision-making tools, techniques, and methodologies. Really, what they're trying to do in most of the training around decision-making is make people smarter. You know, it's about it's about the analytical aspects of decision-making.
Well, isn't it also that we're trying to get people to be willing to pause, collect more data, walk around the problem, take time, don't dive into it quite as quickly. So It is trying to get people to adopt a process that maybe slows them down at the appropriate time.
And so we thought about that, and we said, you know, I think that's good training. We would say that doing that is good.
Yep.
But our approach is slightly different. What we looked for we tried to say, are there some behaviors, some enabling behaviors that help people that when we looked at data, and this is 100,000 leaders, when we looked at data from 100,000 leaders, could we find some specific behaviors that if people did them well, really enabled them to make better decisions? And as you think about this process and this idea, we oftentimes talk about good to great. And you know, if you think about problem-solving skills, analytical skills, using artificial intelligence, enhancing the decision-making process, those things get you to good. But what gets you to great? What helps you to be exceptional? And what skills would really be important in that process? And so as we looked at the data and analyzed 87,000 leaders, what we found is there were 4 key behaviors that seem to enable people to make better decisions: courage, deep knowledge and expertise, clear strategy and direction, and driving for results. Now, on the self-assessment, you rank ordered questions, but really what we were trying to do was get your preference at those 4 different enabling behaviors to help you understand which one of those you tended to lean to or to do most often. So let's talk about these 4 enabling behaviors. And the first one is courage. At the end of the day, what's difficult about decisions is they're visible. Mm-hmm. And your name goes on, doesn't it? You know, I mean, people will. I remember I worked at a foods company once, was consulting with a foods company, and I said, "Who's that guy over there?" And he's the one that made the decision. And this was 10 years old. That decision was made 10 years before that. But that name, that decision stuck with him for 10 years. And it's amazing. So it does take some courage to make a good decision. And you never are 100% sure. You never are 100% sure. And somebody needs to sort of make that final decision, and the ability to do that and the courage that it takes. And we found that that's a critical aspect of making a good decision.
Well, and I would observe too here, Joe, that we began this webinar by talking about this notion of decisiveness and good decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that courage is very related to the issue of decisiveness.
Yeah.
That the willingness to, knowing that a decision needs to be made, your willingness to make it, and then act on it is really a synonym for courage. I mean, it really does have a lot to do with your willingness to kind of take action.
And at the end of the day, people believe that if they get enough facts, the decision will be made for them. That never happens. There's always questions, and it does take courage.
Okay, our second finding was that there needed to be a clear strategy and direction. And it seems to me here that we now see this companion behavior being very much related to the decision process, that the first step in the decision process was to look at the big picture, to understand the reason, the objective. Why are we making this decision? What's the end result that we're seeking? And so the ability to have the big picture, to understand the reason for making the decision, to understand the cost of indecision, that really very much now swings to the other scissor, which is how do we improve the quality of the decision process?
Yeah. The third thing is deep expertise. And, it's absolutely critical, that you have some knowledge and expertise when you make a decision. What's fascinating about this is that oftentimes for managers, they feel like they ought to have all the answers. And one of the real cautions here is you don't need all the expertise, but you need access to that expertise,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
You need to go to the people that do have the expertise, and you need to talk to them, and you need to get that information from others. Jack and I have participated in these decision-making games like Winter Survival or Lost at Sea. There was even one. Did you ever do the 12 Angry Men?
Yes.
Which is it's a movie where they have a guilty. Well, everybody's guilty except for one guy is non-guilty on a sentence, and then they all this one person that votes not guilty changes everybody's mind, and you just. Individually, you vote who's going to change first and who's going to change last, and then as a group, you make a decision. What's true in all those exercises is the group decision is always better. But what we know is that if you have knowledge and expertise, it really helps in terms of making a good decision.
And the fourth element that the research showed was this closing of the circle, that you bring together the making of a decision and implementing it. So this is the point where you begin to deliver results. It links decisiveness to decision making, all for the purpose of attaining an important business outcome or business result. And so it's interesting that this research now kind of brings together these two big ideas of decisiveness and decision quality and gives supporting evidence for the four behaviors that make those happen?
I think that oftentimes average decisions that are well executed end up being good decisions, right? And when people forget about the implementation part of a decision, and that's where the results come in, that's where it comes. So as you think about these four elements, these four dimensions, courage, clear strategy and direction, knowledge and expertise, and delivers results, those are the four things we assessed in the beginning of your survey. And let me tell you, as we did the analysis on this, we found some interesting results relative to these four things in decision-making effectiveness. What we looked at was whether you were below average or above average in terms of your effectiveness on these four dimensions. And if you were below average on all four of these, your average effectiveness in terms of making decisions was at the 19th percentile. If you were above average on one, your effectiveness at making decisions went to the 36th percentile. If you were above average on two, it went to the 49th percentile. On three, to the 63rd percentile. And on four, to the 82nd percentile. As you think about this, what this is telling us is that really, if you can be pretty good at three of these enabling behaviors, that puts you as above average at making decisions. But if you were good at all four, and by good here, we're saying above average, so not spectacular, but these seem to be four kind of critical elements that if you don't do one well, then it sort of really diminishes your effectiveness at making decisions. So all four really help you to do it. And so right now I'd like you to look at the second part of your output on your self-assessment. And it gives you a score for each of the four enabling behaviors. Now, here's what we know about your scores. We know that this is your preference, not your effectiveness. But we also know that high preference is correlated with effectiveness, that you tend to be better at those things where you have a higher preference because you're naturally inclined towards it. Now, this isn't always true 100% of the time, but it is more than it's not. In other words, we have a pretty good correlation there that suggests that the higher your score, the better the more effective you were on that particular dimension. So, as you think about how to become a more effective decision maker, we'd ask you to think about two criteria to kind of make that decision. And the first one is your lowest score. Because our guess is that your lowest score would be your least effective area here in terms of how you can make better decisions. So there's a high correlation there. But we'd also encourage you to consider which of those four dimensions would help you in your current job, would help you in your current situation to improve. And really, what we do in our jobs is really help leaders to get better, help leaders to improve. So based on that, we'd like you to select one of those elements for improvement. Would you choose courage? Would you choose strategic direction? Would you choose knowledge and expertise? Would you choose delivering results? Which of those would help you improve in your job? Which of those got your lowest score in terms of your preference? And based on that, we'd encourage you now to kind of create a development plan. Now, just deciding on one of those things to get better at is the first phase of improvement, but it shouldn't be the last. Because what we know about development plans is that they're not very useful if they're general. A good friend of mine and a colleague, Gene Dalton, used to say that in order for people to change, they need to go from a general idea about change to a specific idea about change. So every New Year's, I make a New Year's resolution of just being a better human.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I love to do that because I have nothing to do. But if I was really specific about it and I said, so what am I going to do to be a better human? Then I would start to really say, well, there's 3 or 4 or 10 things that I ought to do to really be a better human. And that's what we've tried to do. And what we've done for each of these 4 things is we've created some specific suggestions about what you can do to, let's say, have courage, really set clear direction and strategy, some very specific actions to take, knowledge and expertise, and delivering results. Now, we won't go through these now. We don't have time in the webinar to go through and talk about these now. But we have included them, and if you go to the questionnaire that evaluates the effectiveness of the webinar, and by the way, we'd love your feedback on this. There's a link in that questionnaire which lets you download a PDF which will give you all of these specific actions that you can take to help you be a better decision maker. I've enjoyed talking to you about decision making today, Jack and I have, and one of the things that we want to remind you about, the self-assessment gets your preference at these enabling behaviors, but some people say, I really want to understand my effectiveness on decision making. Now, the best way to get a really precise assessment of how effective you are at decision making is to get a 360 assessment. Decision making is one of the 19 differentiating behaviors that, as we've done our analysis and looked at what separates great leaders from average and poor leaders, decision making is one of those competencies. Now, in the slide deck that we've gone through today in the webinar here, one of the slides shows you the correlation between decision-making effectiveness and overall leadership effectiveness. We know that decision-making and the way we measure it is a valid predictor of overall leadership effectiveness, and that slide demonstrates that well. If you're interested in finding out a little bit about how we measure decision-making effectiveness, please check with us. We'd love to show you some more information about that and help you to understand our 360 assessments and how they can help you really build the leadership development that you need to be successful in your organization.
So that's it. We just invite you very much to follow through and download this development guide and go through the list of different specific action steps that would help you to get better at what you've selected. And in doing that, it really greatly increases your chances of seeing the kind of improvement that you would like. In conclusion to this webinar today, we would close by repeating a wonderful statement from the late Theodore Roosevelt. In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. With that, we thank you for having joined us today, and again invite your feedback and any questions that you would have for us.
Thank you.